Good morning, friends. I am Sachin Ketkar. I teach English at the MS University of Baroda, and I have with me my friend Pankti Desai, and she is from the SPB College of Business Administration, Udna, and we have a very interesting and exciting topic on our hands. We are going to talk about one of the most influential and powerful tradition of poetry in the world, and that is American poetry. And if there is one thing that Americans should really be proud of, apart from their opulence or military power or Hollywood, is their poetry. So what we are going to do, Pankti and me, we have brought a slideshow. We are going to look at the tradition of American poetry with special reference to Whitman, Robert Frost, and Emily Dickinson. But our emphasis will be totally on the tradition of American poetry, some peculiarities, the main features of American poetry. So what we are going to do, we are going to start with our discussion on the tradition of American poetry. So before we start, let us look at what the term American means. So let us look at the slides that we have brought. All of us know that the word America is another name for the United States of America, also known as the US or the US of A. So it stands for that geographical location on the North Hemisphere called America. Then who are Americans? Americans are the indigenous people of America or the Native Americans who are believed to have migrated from Asia between 12,000 and 40,000 years ago. And it was only in 1492 that the explorer named Christopher Columbus, under the contract of Spanish crown, made the first contact with this indigenous people. And he is the person who has coined the phrase Red Indians, because he was looking for a new route to Asia and India. So the earliest American poetry would be before the European contact, that is before 1492. And the poetry before founding of the United States was largely oral. It was oral tradition. And after the founding of the 13 colonies, British colonies in the United States, most of the colonial poetry, that is the poetry of Europeans who had come down to America, was based largely on British poetry of the 17th century. And the influence of Puritanism is clearly felt in American poetry, the reason being the people who went to America from Britain many of them were Puritans. And as all the students of English literature know, Puritans were a sect of Christians who believed that Reformation was further needed in English church. And one of the most famous Puritan writer, as we all know, is John Milton. One of the earliest poets of British colony was Anne Bradstreet, and she was also one of the earliest women poets who wrote in English. So if you look at the period 1612 to 1672, then this is the 17th century, and the earliest American, one of the most important earliest American poets was Anne Bradstreet. The post-independence American poetry, the 13 American colonies founded by the people who went from Britain to America and who had settled on the western side of American subcontinent, they declared themselves as independent of British Empire on 4th July 1776. And this day, as we all know, is the Independence Day of America. Along with independence came need to be independent as far as literature also went. So the need to be free from the British poetic models and traditions is one of the important concerns of post-independence American poets. Some of the most important poets of the 19th century, that is the post-independence period, were the poets like Ralph Waldo Emerson, Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, and Edgar Allan Poe. One of the most important feature, as we said, we are going to look at the tradition of American poetry, and one of the most important and significant features of American poetry is the search for distinctive American voice, the voice that is essentially, authentically American, and that can emerge only if people find their true identity. And this search for distinctive American voice and identity is reflected in the presence of American landscape and native traditions in their poetry. So most of the poets who wrote in this period wrote about their own landscape, the prairies, the New England, and the other areas of United States featured prominently in their poetry. One of the very important movements, cultural movements in America after independence, after 1776, is the movement called American Transcendentalism. Transcendentalism is one of very important movements in America, and it started as a protest against general state of culture and society in America. It was founded on the belief that the ideal spiritual state transcends or goes beyond the physical and the empirical, and hence can be realized only through the individual's intuition rather than through doctrines of established religions. So American Transcendentalism was a kind of critical movement which sought to establish a different kind of religion, which is not the same as the established church or established dogma. So what we see here is a desire to break away from social conventions and established religious practices that we find in Transcendentalism. One of the very interesting aspects of Transcendentalism is the influence of Indian spiritual traditions, especially as it went to Germany, and from Germany it went to Britain, and from Britain it went to America. So this is one of the prominent characteristics of American Transcendentalism. Especially if you look at poetry of Longfellow, then you find poems written on subjects like Brahma, and he has written poems on Gita and so on. The prominent Transcendentalists included people like Ralph Waldo Emerson, Henry David Thoreau. Thoreau, as we all know, is one of the influential thinkers who has influenced Mahatma Gandhi. Thoreau's very important book on civil disobedience was adapted by Gandhiji for his own political purpose. And Walt Whitman, 1819 to 1892, whom we are going to look at a little bit more closely. What is interesting here is also that some of the novelists like Melville, who wrote very famous novel like Moby Dick, were also greatly influenced by Transcendentalism. Transcendentalism was a distinctive, as we see on the slide, was a distinctly American strain of English Romanticism, as represented by William Wordsworth and Samuel Taylor Coleridge. Emerson, an American scholar, a very influential philosopher, went to Britain and is believed to have met Wordsworth and Coleridge, and that is how influence from Germany went to Britain, and from Britain it went to America. With Transcendentalism, we find a kind of manifesto that manifesto for the search of true American voice. Emergence of true American voice coincided with Emerson's very important essay called American Scholar in 1837, where he says, "Our day of dependence, our long apprenticeship to the learning of other land draws to close." It is seen as something as American Declaration of Independence at intellectual level. So scholarship declared themselves to be free of British tutelage. Two very different poets represent the emergence of this new spirit of freedom and genuine American voice, and these are the two poets that we are going to look at a bit closely, and those two poets are Walt Whitman and Emily Dickinson. These two poets, as we know, are extremely different. And the difference between these two is the difference between two American poetic idioms, the way, the styles and way of expression which are characteristic of American poetry. A very important literary critic named Louis Untermeyer, in his book called Modern American Poetry, notes that these two poets represent two major American poetic idioms: the free metric, that is the free verse, and direct emotional expression of Walt Whitman, and gnomic obscurity and irony of Dickinson. The word gnomic is very interesting. Gnomic implies a kind of mysterious and supernatural obscurity, Gnomes, as we know, are supernatural beings like elves. Both of these kind of idioms would stamp the American poetry of 20th century. These are two almost models which people followed. Now I'm going to talk to Pankti and tell her to tell us a bit more about Walt Whitman, who is probably one of the most important American poets of 19th century. So let's look at Walt Whitman. Pankti.
He is America. Whitman is often called America's first poet of democracy. Modernist poet Ezra Pound said he is America. Walt Whitman was born into a working-class family in West Hills, New York, a village near Hempstead, Long Island, on May 31, 1819, just 30 years after George Washington was inaugurated as the first president of the newly formed United States. Walt Whitman's life. Whitman worked as a journalist, a teacher, a government clerk, and a volunteer nurse during the American Civil War, in addition to publishing his poetry.
Pankti, American Civil War is something that we should as a step aside and look at the historical context of American Civil War, because it's one of the most influential event in the history of the United States of America. Civil War started between the two regions of America known as Northern America and Southern America. The Northern Americans were largely industrial kind of area, and the Southern was largely agrarian and agriculture. And there was a lot of slavery prevalent in the southern area of America, and so the Civil War was fought over an issue which was to actually determine the fate of American literature in 20th century, and that issue was race. Slavery, the blacks, the African American people brought from Africa, and their freedom was one of the central issues. And as we know, Abraham Lincoln was one of the most important persons who decided the fate of American democracy, and that's why Whitman also celebrates Abraham Lincoln, and he himself served in American Civil War.
Yes. After a stroke towards the end of his life, he moved to Camden, New Jersey, where his health further declined. He died at the age of 72, and his funeral became a public spectacle. Whitman's an American epic. He is known as Whitman's. He has written Whitman's major work, Leaves of Grass, was first published in 1855 with his own money. The work was an attempt at reaching out to the common person with an American epic. He continued expanding and revising it until his death in 1892. Leaves of Grass.
So Pankti, interestingly, he continued to edit and add to single collection that he brought out, that was Leaves of Grass, for 40 to 50 years of his life. That's very interesting.
Yeah, till the end of his life.
Yeah.
Leaves of Grass. Walt Whitman, at the age of 37, frontispiece to Leaves of Grass, still engraving by Samuel Hollier. Leaves of Grass. Leaves of Grass has its genesis in an essay called The Poet by Emerson, which expressed the need for the United States to have its own new and unique poet to write about the new country's virtues and vices. The title Leaves of Grass was a pun. Grass was a term given by publishers to work of minor value, and leaves is another name for the pages on which they were printed.
Pankti, interestingly, the pun on the title itself is very interesting.
Yes.
Leaves of Grass. Grass signifies not just an element of landscape in poetry. There is a pun on grass. Grass means a minor work. But actually what Whitman was doing is that he is writing the first American epic.
Yes.
And that's how he seems to have founded the entire tradition of American poetry single-handedly with this Leaves of Grass.
Yes, I agree with you. Once Self I Sing, one of the most important poems in Leaves of Grass. oneself I sing, oneself I sing, a simple, separate persona, yet another in world, yet utter the word democratic, the word en masse of life immense in passion, pulse and power, cheerful for freest action, formed under the laws divine, the modern man I sing. Terry Mulcair on One's Self I Sing. A poetic universe of productive tension is hinted by that, yet the tense equipoise between individualism and democracy this poem suggests is the foundational theme of Whitman's book. The poem then goes on to introduce the site and symbol for this reconciliation of individual to mass, the body. I sing the body electric. This radical power of human body is celebrated in the poem I Sing the Body Electric. I sing the body electric, I sing the body electric, the armies of those I love engird me, and I engird them. They will not let me off till I go with them, respond to them, and discorrupt them, and charge them full with the charge of the soul.
Panti, the word discorrupt is very interesting in the poet. We have all heard of the term corrupt, and what would actually discorrupt our soul would be our body. So this is a very new way of looking at body. Whitman seems to be doing two things here. One, he seems to find that body is what connects a separate individual to entire mass of humanity. So he seems to be reconciling the individualistic spirit of America with the democratic spirit. There seems to be some tension between the two, democracy versus individualism. And what Mulcair is saying that he strikes the balance between individualism and democratic spirit, and he does it by focusing on human body. And that is why human body becomes a site of celebration for Whitman. And he was very bold in celebration of human body, his own body, and that's why he ran into trouble with censorship. And many of people were very angry with Whitman for writing what they thought was very obscene and very explicit sexual things. So Leaves of Grass also had to enter into this obscenity trial. But what Whitman is doing is he is celebrating human body as something which reconciles individualism versus democratic spirit. And that is why he sings, I sing the body electric. That's very interesting.
Yeah. The self and the I. Whitman seems to put himself in the center, but the self of the poem speaker, the I of the poem, should not be limited to or confused with the person of the historical Walt Whitman. This is an expansive persona, one that has exploded the conventional boundaries of the self. As he say, I am large, I contain multitudes. Some other poems of Whitman are Out of the Cradle, Endlessly Rocking, I Hear America Singing, A Noiseless Patient Spider. His poems like When Lilac Last and the Dooryard Bloomed and Oh Captain, My Captain are elegies on the death of Abraham Lincoln.
So what we see here in life and works of Walt Whitman is the founding theme of American poetic tradition. How to reconcile democratic instinct or democratic spirit with individualism at the same time. How to reconcile with seemingly opposite forces. We also see that what Whitman is doing is he is breaking himself free from fetters of British poetic traditions as represented by meters and rhymes of British poetry, the iambics and trochees. What he is doing here, he is using free words. So use of free words stands for declaration of freedom as far as poetic expression was concerned. So you can say that what Emerson did in American Scholar was he declared scholarship to be free from colonial heritage. What Whitman is doing, that he is declaring his own freedom as an American poet in Leaves of Grass. And that's why Walt Whitman is one of the most important poets of American poetic tradition. Now what we are going to do is we are going to look at somebody who is extremely different, almost contrasting to Walt Whitman. While Walt Whitman lived a life which was bohemian, which was rebellious, which was very, very extroverted, very, very public, what we find here is another person named Emily Dickinson. Let's look at her life. Emily Dickinson is one of the most important American poets and contemporaries of Walt Whitman. They belong to the same period. She was born 10th December 1930 in Amherst, Massachusetts, where she lived until her death on 15th May 1886. Although she was a very prolific poet, she wrote thousands, almost hundreds and thousands of poems. Only fewer than a dozen of her 1800 poems were published during her lifetime. She stayed away from public fame and gaze, unlike Walt Whitman, who seems to be very public, very open in his expression. Emily Dickinson is reserved, she is reclusive. And what we can do is very interestingly contrast the poem like I sing myself, oneself I sing, with this poem that we have in front of us. And this poem is, I am nobody, who are you? Dickinson writes, I am nobody, who are you? Are you nobody too? Then there's a pair of us. Don't tell, they would advertise, you know. How dreary to be somebody. How public, like a frog. To tell one's name, the livelong June, to an admiring bog. So, while Whitman is celebrating his self, oneself I sing, Dickinson is saying that I am nobody. And that is why, and it's such a great thing to be nobody. Unlike the American desire to be somebody. Right? So, Dickinson seems to be asserting her own individuality by saying that I don't want to live like how most of the people live. Let's look at her life. Emily Dickinson. Dickinson was a private and introverted person who disliked fame. As the poem I Am Nobody shows, Adrienne Rich notes that this privacy, this seclusion, this reclusiveness was actually freedom to her. Her decision not to be very public, not to live a very public life, is the decision which gave her freedom to be who she was. Dickinson's life as well as her poetry stands in complete contrast to Whitman, as we will see. Let's look at her style. Emily Dickinson's style is something very unique, and we can very profitably compare it with Walt Whitman's style. While Walt Whitman wrote long sentences in free verse, and almost you can say that there is an influence of Christian Bible, King James Bible, on Whitman's style. Dickinson's poems are poems with very short lines. They lack titles. They have slant rhymes, means words that do not rhyme completely, only their consonants rhyme, not their vowels. And unconventional capitalization that you will find. All of a sudden you will find a word being capitalized. And a very strange use of punctuation. So what Dickinson seems to be doing is that she is almost rejecting British tradition in her own way. So on one hand you have Walt Whitman, who rejects British traditions by writing free verse. Here you have Emily Dickinson, who rejects free verse, and she rejects also the British tradition by writing very short, very standard kind of format, and very strange way of writing that she has evolved. Let us look at what she wrote about her major themes. Many of her poems deal with the themes of death and immortality, two recurring topics in her letter to her friends. And we again see influence of American transcendentalism on her philosophy and her outlook to life. So these are two very important themes, but these are not, of course, the only themes. Let's look at her very famous poem here. Because I could not stop for death, because I could not stop for death, he kindly stopped for me. The carriage held but just ourselves and immortality. The very famous and noted critic Alan Tate says about this very typical Dickinson poem is, if the word great means anything in poetry, the poem is one of the greatest in English language. The tradition of American poetry can be represented by contrasting figures of Whitman and Dickinson. What seems to unite them both is the distinctive and very individualistic voice that is at once very American and very powerful.
The tradition of American poetry. Let's look at the slide. The tradition of American poetry, the passionate quest for genuine American identity and the spirit of non-conformity continued in the 20th century. The rise of modernism. Modernism emerged in the early part of the 20th century as a reaction against the sentimental and romantic Victorian period. Let us look at the rise of modernism. Ezra Pound and T.S. Eliot steered American poetry towards greater density, difficulty, and opacity, with the use of techniques like fragmentation, ellipsis, illusion, juxtaposition, ironic and shifting persona, and mythic parallelism.
Pankti, if you look at the term modernism, then it's not very surprising that it's an American invention almost. It's almost a term that is invented by Americans. It started in America, and it's not very surprising that it started in America, because look at Whitman, look at Dickinson. They are the people who seem to be rejecting tradition in search of their own self and their own authentic voice. They seem to be rejecting tradition. And what else is modernism but rejecting conventional ways of writing and thinking in favor of authentic and what you are, something which is close to who you are. So in some ways, Whitman and Dickinson also are modernist in that sense.
Yes. Two early modernists, Ezra Pound and T.S. Eliot. Imagism. Modernist poetry in English is generally considered to have emerged with the appearance of the Imagist movement. Imagism favored precision of imagery and clear, sharp language, and rejected the sentiment and discursiveness typical of much romantic and Victorian poetry. They emphasized the use of free verse. Other modernist poets. Other modernist poets of the period include Gertrude Stein, Wallace Stevens, William Carlos Williams, Hilda Doolittle, Marion Moore, E. Cummings, and Hart Crane. Let us look at Robert Frost, the major American modernist poet.
Right. Very interestingly, relationship of Robert Frost with modernism was a very different kind of modernism that he seems to have invented for himself. Robert Frost did not actually belong to the school of Ezra Pound or T.S. Eliot or even Wallace Stevens kind of poetry, which was very dense, very opaque, very fragmented, almost incomprehensible kind of poetry that these people wrote. Robert Frost wrote poetry which people could understand. But in spite of this, what he seems to be doing is that he is bringing in a very distinctive American flavor, American ethos and American locale into his poetry. At the same time, he is bringing in a very modern kind of sensibility. This is the picture of Robert Frost, 1874 to 1963. He is one of the most influential American poets of 20th century. Let's look at some of the details about his life, and these details are also very interesting. Robert Frost was born in San Francisco on March 26, 1874. He moved to New England at the age of 11 and became interested in reading and writing poetry during his high school years in Lawrence, Massachusetts. New England is the area where the earliest British colonies settled in 15th century, and these were the 13 colonies, American colonies, which declared themselves free from British colonial power. So there is something very British and English about it, and that's why it's called New England. And a person from New England is often called Yankee. So Robert Frost wrote about Yankee life and Yankee culture. He was enrolled in Dartmouth College. Let's look at the slide. In 1892, and later at Harvard, though he never earned a formal degree. He never earned a formal BA or MA. Poetry of Robert Frost. Let's look at his works. Robert Frost is highly regarded for his realistic depictions of rural life and his command of American colloquial speech. Though his poems avoid the experimental excesses and techniques of modernist contemporaries like Ezra Pound or like William Carlos Williams or like E. E. Cumming, his poetry is also very modern and very American sensibilities can be detected in a Frost poetry. Besides that, the influence of imagism, as we have seen earlier, the imagism is also seen clearly on his works. And it's no surprise that the group of poets around who were clubbed as imagists, and when they were running a magazine called Poetry, one of the oldest little magazines and one which still probably survives, this Poetry magazine first published poems of Robert Frost. His work frequently employed settings from rural life in New England in the early 20th century, using them to examine complex social philosophical themes. Though poems which look very simple or they deal with very ordinary, mundane day-to-day life, the poems have some philosophical significance which lies beyond the lines of his poem. A popular and often quoted poet, Frost was honored frequently during his lifetime, receiving 4 Pulitzer Prizes for poetry, and that's very surprising for a person who had no formal degree of BA or MA. Mending Wall, a typical Frost poem is Mending Wall. Probably many of the students might be familiar with this poem, Mending Wall, which appeared in North of Boston in 1914. It is a meditative lyric that reports and assesses a dialogue between neighbors who have joined in an annual occupation of rebuilding the wall which separates them. There is this annual ritual almost where, because of heavy snow, the walls which separate the fences, which separate the farms, actually have broken down. So it's an annual ritual where both the farmers get together and replace the wall. Now this activity is made into a very symbolic activity in Frost poems, and these are the very famous lines. Good fences make good neighbor. The poem Mending Wall re-examines the stock belief regarding the relationship between human beings and the relationship of human beings with nature. The speaker in the poem, a New England farmer, a typical Yankee farmer, questions the conventional wisdom of mankind. Good fences make good neighbors. And he seems to ironically indicate that the forces of nature do not accept human boundaries. Though good fences may make good neighbors, nature does not recognize any neighbors and human boundaries. Let's look at another very famous poems by Frost. It's titled Stopping by Woods on a Snowy Evening. Probably students might be familiar with this very famous poem, which appeared in the Robert Frost 1922 collection, New Hampshire, and it's widely known. And very interestingly, look at the title of this collection, New Hampshire, again indicating the region and the locale where it came from. So regionality, this sense of belonging to a particular region, is very important aspect of Frost's poetry. The last stanza of the poem is extremely famous. Let's look at these very famous lines. The woods are lovely, dark and deep, but I have promises to keep, and miles to go before I sleep, and miles to go before I sleep. These lines are so famous that Jawaharlal Nehru is believed to have kept these lines on his table. And that's why they are so famous even in India today. A very well-known critic, Jeffrey Myers, has his own take on this poem. The poem is read simplistically as a conflict between duty and beauty, or between romantic worldview and a practical, pragmatic view. Jeffrey Myers says that the theme of stopping by woods is temptation of death, even suicide, symbolized by the woods that are filling up with snow on the darkest evening of the year. The speaker says the woods are lovely, dark and deep, but he resists their morbid attraction, as if the poet is thus selecting life over death, in spite of the fact that death is so attractive and beautiful. Death is something which is much of a temptation for the speaker. In spite of that, the speaker makes a choice that I have to go miles before I really actually sleep. Let's look at another very famous poem by Frost. And the poem is The Road Not Taken. One of the most famous American poems is The Road Not Taken by Robert Frost. It was published in the collection Mountain Intervals in 1916. The speaker in the poem is a traveler who is remembering his journey. He says that he had to make a choice between two roads at an important juncture in his life. The speaker, the traveler, says, at the end of the poem he says, I shall be telling this with a sigh, somewhere ages hence. Two roads diverge in the wood, that I took the one less travelled by, and that has made all the difference. The traveller's choice in living unconventional life indicates his philosophical outlook, his individualism, and non-conformist attitude. And in some way for me, Pankti, this attitude of selecting the road which is less travelled by is characteristic of modern American poetic tradition. It almost symbolizes American poetry. The journey of American poetry can be summed up as follows.
The attitude of American poets are like those of the speaker, individualist, non-conformist, and always keen to venture into unknown territories. The American tradition of the new. The major American poets like Walt Whitman, Emily Dickinson, and Robert Frost have always believed in taking the road which is usually not taken and which wanted were. The American tradition of the new. Consequently, they have made all the difference to literary tradition by opening new pathway and streets, and hence have been immensely influential internationally.
Pankti, very interestingly is the whole idea of very interestingly here is the idea of not taking the road which is well worn, which is taken by many others. So American poetry, if you want to characterize it, then it is the poetry which searches for new areas, right? It searches for the areas which people have not explored.
Yes.
It ventures into it's very courageous kind of poetry which says that we do not want to follow traditions and conventions. What we want to do is to walk on our own path,
True.
the path that we want to live. And that is what makes American poetry so influential all over the world. In fact, the poets that we have mentioned in our discussion, apart from Frost, Whitman, and Dickinson, the poets like William Carlos Williams, E. Cummings, T.S. Eliot, Ezra Pound, Wallace Stevens, are such important influences on all the major languages in the world. Consider Gujarati, consider Marathi. All these Indian languages, modernist poetry of these languages also bear influence of these poets and American tradition. So American tradition is an international tradition in the sense that it has impacted the poetry all over the world.
Yeah, why don't you focus something on postmodern poets after Frost?
Right. Postmodernism in America actually began with rejection of very difficult kind of poetry and very objective, very impersonal, very classical kind of poetry which T.S. Eliot wrote. So there was in some way a rejection of modernism in postmodern American poetry, and it began with what is known as confessional poetry. And confessional poetry says that poetry should not be impersonal, but it must be about your life. It's almost like autobiography. And so what poets seem to be writing in confessional poetry is their own life.
Right.
And they wrote it very courageously. And very famous names are Robert Lowell,
Yes.
Theodore Roethke,
Yeah.
Sylvia
Elizabeth
Plath,
Bishop
right.
and
Adrienne Rich.
Etude.
Right. So these poets wrote poetry which was very much personal.
Yes.
There was also a reaction in what is known as the beat poetry or the hippie poetry, as represented by
William Carl.
no, it's represented by Allen Ginsberg
Yes.
and Jack Kerouac. And Ginsberg wrote a very famous poem called Howl or supermarket in America. And Ginsberg seems to be using none other than Walt Whitman as his model. So Walt Whitman is still alive in American poetry. So is Emily Dickinson, and so is Robert Frost. So Pankti, actually we should thank our listeners for listening to us so attentively. And
same time Isaac Sandan.
Yeah, I would also like to thank Isaac Sandan for giving me opportunity to talk. And both of us wish all our listeners very happy Diwali and New Year in advance. Thank you.
Thank you.